Hey, thank you, Paige, for starting the meeting. Hello, my name is Todd Bodeslaw, and I'm a senior applications developer with ProPlanner. Today, I will be showcasing one of our new modules in Assembly Planner called the 3D Virtual Build. But before I get into that, I'm going to do a basic and quick review of some of a basic concept within Assembly Planner, so it'll help out going forward. In Assembly Planner, we structure things on a tiered level. We start with a routing, as you can see where I'm pointing here, and a routing it indicates an assembly line. Okay, generally speaking, it does. But from that, then the routing will contain workstations, and those we refer to generally as operations. So when I click on a routing, you can see my operations here. Furthermore, um, workstations will require activities at each. So if I drill into one of the activities, so I'm at the operation level, and here's a list of activities. Furthermore, each activity or required work at that workstation are going to have parts that are assembled, to the final assembly. So with that basic concept in mind, I'm going to dive into the 3D module. So we call it Virtual Build. It's available on the library menu. The basic concept of the virtual build module, it ties together all of this process data that I just overviewed, along with a 3D model to give you a better representation of your process. So obviously we want to start with creating a workspace. An interface is provided, I should say, and you can have a list of workspaces here. Any of these columns can be sorted. But obviously we can open, we can edit, and we can create a new workspace. So I will demonstrate that. So we have to give it a name, and for organization's sake, the name has to be unique. You don't have to worry about that. The assembly planner will tell you if it's not unique. Obviously, the next piece that we have to define is which routing do we want to use, right? So when we define a routing, that will pull in those subsequent workstations, of that line, and then additional activities. So we're going to talk about the whole process for a specific routing. I'm going to pick one that I had configured ahead of time for today's demonstration. Okay, so couple notes on this. We are going to pick the format of the converted CAD that we want to use inside Virtual Build. So what I mean by that is quite simple, that we can take in multiple CAD formats. I'm just going to list a few of the more popular ones, but again, I emphasize reaching out to us because we can handle many different types. But of course, we can handle things like Creo Parametric, CATIA files, SolidWorks, some of your more neutral formats, of course, step files and things like that. So what happens is transparent to the user or the engineer at their computer, a conversion takes place in the background. Okay, so we don't want to have to bother them with converting files to bring in. So when we do that conversion, we have a choice of using one of two different file formats. One is called PRC and one's called HSF. Let's put it this way for today's purposes, the difference being PRC will offer you probably a little higher quality, better resolutions, and things like that. With that may come a small performance hit. However, HSF is quite nice. It does convert well, but you sacrifice a little quality for the sake of speed in that case. Okay, enough on that. So when we pick a base CAD file, this typically is the model that we want to focus on, right? So that's our center of attention. I'm going to pick one here. And I'm going to pick a different one for today's demonstration. And I want to point out, although I'm not going to use it today, I do want to point out that you can add additional CAD files. So think of it like this. One example might be if I want to have my base CAD file as an engine assembly. Well, I might not want to show that just hanging in midair. I may want some frames or rail pieces or whatnot of the vehicle we're assembling. So it's like more background or reference geometry. Okay. Another way a person may use this is I have this Rev 002 here. I may want to overlay that on an old Rev of an assembly. So it'll help me with processing an EC or a BOM change, right? So I could pick that. So I can define all of those things in the workspace. Once I have that done, I can hit save the workspace. And when I go to open it, you can see my new workspace is defined. If I made a mistake, of course, I can hit the edit button, brings you right back to that same screen. So I'm going to go ahead and open this workspace that I have just defined. And you can see what we have here. I'll give you a little bit of navigation on some of the basic concepts here first. So on the onset of our meeting today, I talked about the concept of how a process is structured. So we have that same structure here. Up here, we can see the routing that we defined. Each of these first levels in our tree are those operations or workstations, however you'd like to think of them. Underneath that, then we have different activities. Now, obviously, my process is fairly simplistic, only for the purposes of giving you a good demonstration today. But we do handle processes that are very much more defined. I have a lot more operations activities and whatnot. Okay, so then when we click on an assembly, at its most basic operation, you can see here are the parts or consumption, I may refer to it as in my presentation, that is mapped to that particular activity, right? So as I go down, that will change. And that consumption is defined at the activity level inside of Assembly Planner. I only have a few key representative fields identified here for consumption, but I just do want to point out, as in other parts of our software, you can define any fields you want. So you can see I only have a handful of what's available. So you can display what's important to you. And that's just like any other part of our software. All right. So the first thing I'll point out is that in Virtual Build, we have different modes. I'm in what's called default mode right now. We have a virtual build mode, a highlight mode, and an instance mapping mode. I'm going to step through each of those this morning in some level of detail, but just so you can get a feel of it. So let's start with the default mode. I'll show you some of the basic thing that goes on and highlight some of the other features that we have. But I want to point out these features are not necessarily tied only to the default mode. In some cases they are, but generally speaking, they're available in most any of the modes. Obviously, you can change your rendering. Okay, so I have shaded with lines. We can go and take out those lines and shaded, hidden line, and wireframe. So some of the more common rendering modes that people may be used to. We have a zoom fit feature. So let's say I have this thing all zoomed out and like that. Well, I can bring it right back, into view and work with it again, simply like that. We have a zoom area button. So I can define an area that I would like to zoom into on my model, right? So as you can see by the square I just drew, I want to zoom in on that module. So I can just do that, right? And notice that this function is engaged, and you also have a little cheater here in the corner to tell you which tool that you're using at the time. So I could keep going, right? Now, when I'm done using that tool, I can simply hit point select. And that point select is important because it's available in all the various menus that I'll be showing to you today. Okay, so I went back to the default tool. I'm doing a zoom fit. Zoom lens is an upcoming feature that I will not be demonstrating today, but we will be releasing it shortly, as where you can draw, let's say, a bubble on the screen and point to a particular part, and it will show a zoomed in image of that part. So that is in the works. It is coming very soon. Area select is if I want to select a chunk of my model. And so I can just select that portion of the 3D model. Maybe I want to hide that, and I can just end up with that portion of my model, right? Um, so with that, if I want to show all of them again, I can, right? And just by clicking the Show All button. By the way, most all of these functions that I'm talking about are available with a right click on the 3D viewer canvas, right? So we have a refresh the 3D viewer in case that needs to happen. There's a pan feature, although the middle mouse button does act as a default mode for panning. But you know, some people may not be familiar with advanced mouse techniques, so we make that tool available for them there. And of course, you know, we have other tools that I just talked about, and I will be getting in more of these as we go along today. All right, so I could also change the color of a part. So I've selected that bracket there, and maybe I want to change it to more of a red color. So I can just do that. So obviously we have that feature there. All right, also in default mode, what we can do is we can edit some of the consumption fields or parts fields here, okay? So if I say edit consumption, the first thing I want to do is check out the activities, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to be changing records related to a particular activity. And so I need ownership, you know, of that activity. So that's what checkout is, right? It says I have ownership of this process right now. So I can go ahead and edit the consumption. So you can see it's designated by these fields you cannot edit here. But we do have fields that are unlocked that you can modify. So I can change the quantity of that bolt. I can change a reference designator. That's something that's available at our consumption record fields, that you can have a particular designator for that particular component or set of components. It'll become more important in a second. You'll see how we can use that reference designator in creating work instruction or SOP images. You can also specify which work steps. So work steps are defined at the activity level. By default, it will pull down existing work steps that are defined at the activity level, but you can also override those selections there, and I could type in work step 40 if I wanted, with anticipation I'm going to be creating another work step. So I said we can do some editing. What is on our roadmap is to be able to define the consumption records at this level rather than exiting out to the actual activity itself. So that is on the roadmap. But for today, we can edit some of these key fields. I want to point out too, when I'm done here editing consumption, I can just, you know, select the button, and all those modifications I made will be written back to the database and will be available, you know, across the different levels of Assembly Planner. I talked about going out to different processes. One thing I do want to point out, at any time from this module, you can right click on, in my case, the activity, and I can go right to that activity and start working with the different functions inside of it. For instance, here's some of the work step fields I talked about. Here's some of those consumption mapping fields I talked about. So anytime I do any modifications, furthermore, when I come back into Virtual Build, it does an automatic refresh for you, okay? So I can also exit, obviously, to the operations the same way, and even to the routing level if you would like. All right, so that covers the default mode and some of the basic features that we can do there. I'm just to keep myself in check, I'm just going to check in the routing. You don't have to do that, but I did for my purposes and demonstration today.
Also, while in default mode, another important feature to call attention to is this tab right next to process called the CAD model. What the CAD model tab gives you is a hierarchical representation of all the parts defined within inside the 3D model. You can click on a part and it will highlight the part in green. You can also do multi-select using standard Windows controls such as Shift and Control keys, and it can highlight those particular parts. The reason that would be important is you can draw attention to a particular part or help find it. You can also right-click on it and isolate the node, which is the part listed in the tree, or a selection of nodes if you used multi-select. On the CAD model tree, you can also highlight parts and do some other functions there. So I'll highlight this pulley assembly and I can either zoom to it, I can isolate it from here, I can hide and show from a right-click menu. Also, from the consumption grid, you can do some search features here as well. So if you're working with inside this consumption grid and you want to find that particular part, you can right-click and find that particular part number inside of this model tree. So it will highlight it and bring attention so you can help locate it within all of the parts listed in the tree.
The next mode I will show is called the virtual build mode. So what virtual build mode does is allow the user to step through their process. In this case, I will refer to activities. I'm going to step through the activities and virtually build up a 3D representation of those parts that are assembled at each of those activities. Okay, so when I clicked on this first activity, you can see here are the parts that are represented in this consumption grid that we are expected to assemble at that point in our process. As I step down, you can see more and more parts are coming into view. Notice that this one has a line through it. That's to indicate that there is no consumption map. This is a labor only activity or task, right? So I'm not going to consume any parts off racks or out of inventory, etc. So I can keep working down, right? And here's another one with no particular parts mapped to it. And so I can get to that point and I can keep going. However, if you're constructing a true representation of a particular set of parts, so let's say maybe you want to make a particular work instruction image, you may not want all of those parts displayed. So in virtual build mode, you can also edit the activities that are being displayed. So what it does, it says I selected, to this level of my activities, and I can deselect some of these parts. When I'm done with that, I can hit Update 3D Viewer, and you can see it took all those parts away. So I have that representation. And furthermore, I can go back in and turn them back on if I would like, right? So you can go back and forth with that. So that gives the user some flexibility in actually what is being displayed if they want to get down to a level where they want it very refined, for a particular purpose. So that is the virtual build assembly. The next mode that we have is called the highlight mode, right? So highlight mode acts very much, almost identical to virtual build, but it will highlight in red, the parts that are assembled at that particular activity as you step down through your process, right? So you can call attention. Now, this part is still red, notice, because I had um, I had specified it to be red. So I made a conscious decision to have that part be red, right? Back in the beginning, if you recall. So as I step down through my parts here, you can see that various parts are turning red and highlighting what is assembled at that particular activity. Okay. All right. So what I'm saying is that virtual build and highlight mode act very similar. I can get into edit the selected activities just the same way as I did in virtual build. All right. So the next one is instance mapping mode. I may get some questions on this one, but at its most basic form, what instance mapping mode is designed for is to allow you to get down to a granular level of a particular component that you want to be used at that particular activity. For instance, let's say I'm assembling a large vehicle of some sort. And the bolt I have highlighted there, let's say that we use 1,000 of those bolts on that particular vehicle. Well, in that case, which instance of those 1,000 on my 3D viewer or in my CAD model am I talking about? So when it's a one-to-one like this, maybe not as important, but maybe when you get down where you have more than one part used, uh, quantity greater than one, obviously is what I mean, we can map which instances. So again, I point out that users may or may not want to get down to the bolt screw nut level, but think about it in terms of where it becomes kind of important and popular is when you have sub-assemblies that are similar or the same. Think of like a headlight assembly, right? So we're going to obviously usually have two of those. Which one are we talking about? But for today's purposes, I'll demonstrate how this works. So I need to have four mapped, and I click on that row in consumption records. It says, here are your available choices. Well, I know I want this one and I want this one. Notice they turned red and my indicator is starting to move. If I like my selection, I can simply right click, hit accept, and that writes a record and it's going to be saved. So when a user brings up the workspace again, they'll have that information there. So it's not lost, it's not just at the session level. It can stay persistent with that workspace. So and subsequently you notice that I had a cancel button. So obviously I can also unmap, about particular instances if I change my mind, so if I hover over that, I can see I have 2 of 4 mapped. Now, the important thing to point out, this is an available feature. It's not a mandate. All the other functions of 3D virtual build will work just fine. But in this case, it's a feature there that's available for the engineer if they so choose to use it. Okay. All right. So let's step through some of the other modes. I'll go back to default mode just for sake of demonstration. I will try to point out when something is not available in the other modes, but generally speaking, anything I demonstrate can be available with all 4 of those modes that I showed you. So we're back in default mode. I've already demonstrated coloring a part, but the next tab that you see at the top here is views. What views are is I can save a 3D view. So right now, unless I save this view, that part will not come up red again, next time. It'll come back to its default CAD color as designed by the design engineer. So let's say I want that particular angle. Maybe I want to hide a particular part, and I want to save that because I know I'm going to come and reuse this particular view at some point in the future. Obviously, what I can do is hit the drop down for create view. I give it a name of my choosing. Again, for obvious reasons, it has to be unique. And again, the software will remind you if it's not. If a user tries to reuse a previously used name. Um, you can offer a description if you want, so there, you don't have to. The only thing that's really required is the view name, but a description, you can keep some notes for yourself in that particular field. When I'm satisfied, I hit save, and now I can come back to that particular view um, in the future. So let's show all and go from there. Let's reposition it so we know something different is going to happen. Now in the future, if I want to come back to that particular view, I can come right back to where I set it. If I change my mind, I want to color some parts differently, I can do so. And while that view is selected, I can hit update view, right? So then it overwrites the previous settings, and now I have the new view. If I made a mistake, I want to remove one. Of course, we give that capability. The next button you'll see on this particular menu is called a snapshot. This allows you to grab an image of what's on your 3D canvas. So it gives you a little preview. This preview has some basic editing capabilities in it. So I can do some basic things like cropping and coloring and balance, some of the more typical photo editing capabilities. But let's say I don't want that cube and I don't want that axis down in the corner, so I can simply crop here. It's all I'm doing. And saying, yep, I like that. I can save that back to the preview screen. Okay. We have three different, I guess I would call them functions at this point that we can perform. We can save this as a snapshot. We can go directly to annotating the image for work instruction or SOP purposes. Or if we like this image as is, we can set this as an SOP image or a work instruction image right down to the particular work step as defined on the activity. That's an important point I was not clear on. All of these snapshots, photos, work instruction images are tied directly to the activity that's selected in our process tree. So just a quick note on snapshots. Snapshots may be, I'm not interested in this particular image for a work instruction, but I may want to collect several to make one work instruction images in the future. In other words, I want different views and zooms and whatnot for that final image. So I can collect things against the activity as snapshots and then compile them in our image editor. So with that background, I'm going to open up the image editor. I'm going to go in straight and annotate this image. So we have a new, for those of you that have used our software in the past, we have developed a brand new image editor that has a lot more capabilities and usability features than our previous one. And so it's kind of exciting. And so I'm going to demonstrate some of the core features here. Pardon me, I just grabbed a drink of water. All right. So when I open up our image editor, I put that snapshot right on the image because I said I wanted that, right? Obviously, I can come into the image editor and have a blank canvas and start constructing from there. The intention of this is if at first glance you're saying, wow, this looks a lot like Microsoft Visio, well, it's intended to. And because it gives people a sense of familiarity with the usage of it. So we have the concept of stencils. We have many stencils available. We have standard SOP annotations. So that is right out of the box, right? We ship that, for ProPlanner will ship these right out of you so you can get working right away. I will show you in a few minutes how you can define your own at a organizational level. You don't necessarily have to keep coming back to us anytime you want a new annotation or recreate it each time. But we have out of the box, we have some basic call outs, right? And I can go in here and I can type, something. Maybe I want that to be number 3, or I want, something of that nature. Auto ID means for the session, I can just increment call outs. So you can see I have 1, 2, so on and so forth. I can have a basic text box call out. So this is a text box with the arrow, a floating text box, highlight circles. Now notice, think back to earlier in the presentation, I talked about that reference designator, a particular part. What we do is we grab all of those reference designators for this particular activity, and we all auto create those call outs for you. So when you're think of it this way, when you're constructing your work instruction image, you may be talking about a particular part that is defined as reference designator A, and there it is for you, right? So all of these arrows, by the way, although I'm not doing it on everyone, everything is movable, configurable. I did move that image around. The image is sizable. The arrows can be moved around too, right? So you can configure this thing kind of infinitely. Out of the box, we will ship some standard assembly icons. So these are like images that you can drag and drop, on there. We can have hearing protection, for instance. We can have a warning symbol, and this is all out of the box. Just like the other annotations, you or an administrator of the system can define symbols, icons, whatnot at the company level. So again, that's an important distinction. I said at the administrator level. So administrators can configure these icons for the organization. For instance, if something is called out in a procedure that this symbol of this configuration shall always be used, that can be controlled at that level. Okay, so as I said, we can define down at a custom level or to your needs, right? And so I will demonstrate how those are defined in a moment, but you can add any number of annotations that you would like for your company. There's also basic shapes, that you can use. And even on more shapes, there is a ton more of icons, that the user can use. All right. So going back to that concept of snapshots and SOP images, snapshots are a collection of those screen grabs that I was doing at the activity because I want to reuse them to make something bigger, right? So I could just take and drag and drop that on there. Of course, I can size it and I can move that around, right? So obviously I'm not making a glorious looking work instruction image here, but it's more to illustrate the points. And I can rearrange those as I want. Just as in that preview screen, I can select an image, I can right click on it, and I can do some of that cropping and maneuvering, saturation, colorizations, so on and so forth right here as well, okay? We also have the ability, just as an overview, I can add connectors, other shapes up here. But another important feature to users is you may not only want to use images or snapshots from a 3D model. Maybe you have a piece of machinery or a fixture on your shop floor that you want to use. Well, you can grab a photo from wherever, saved on your computer and bring that in. We do have a default type container here that you can type in whatever text you would want. If I could spell this morning, there we go. And then, you can place that right on. Okay, when I'm satisfied with how this looks, as ugly as it is this morning, but we can go ahead and save that image. So that image has been saved as an SOP image. Now, those of you that are familiar with our software, SOP images are the images that will appear in different reports related to work instruction reports. All right. If I want to edit that particular image, this looks like maybe the one I was working on, I go to the tab of SOP images and I can select that and I can say edit image. Now, this is an important concept because what happens when I save that SOP image, it saved two files. One is a flattened 2D representation of what I created. However, the definition file for that is also saved in the background in Assembly Planner. Why that's important, it allows me to go back in and make some modifications. So you don't have to recreate your 2D image every time, right? So I can go and make those changes. I want to point out something before I hit save. I can assign it right to a work step also inside of this image editor. And these are, again, the work steps that are defined for that particular activity. Okay. I can go ahead and hit save. And now all those modifications that I made, you can see I've been messing around quite a bit, but are saved back to the SOP images associated with this particular activity. You can see I have it highlighted down here in my status bar at the bottom of the screen. For sake of time, I want to point out a few features on how this is configurable. Okay, so I talked a lot about it in the beginning, but I want to point out an admin. Usually it's typically people with an administrator role privilege in Assembly Planner can do this. So the organization can control the creation of these things. So an administrator can create another shape that will be defined in those company specific annotations, right? So I can just drag and drop on there. I can add connectors. I can add other shapes. I can change the background or fill color with the line color. I can give it a name and save it. So that allows you a lot of flexibility. And that template of those shapes is saved in a template that is separate from the standard shapes. So that can be reused, so think in terms of upgrading Assembly Planner as we come up with new releases for you. Your template of your annotations are not lost, right? So we can bring those back in easily. I also talked about using image files or shapes, or excuse me, images or symbols or icons, some companies refer them to, and they have their own distinct ones. Well, here's a way to do that. You simply navigate to where the icon would be located, specify it in there. It's going to give you a little preview of that image and you create it, okay? And when you create it, it's going to specify or request that you give it a name. If we make a mistake or some of those symbols or custom shapes become obsolete, we can come in here, we can select the ones that we want to delete or remove from the system and hit delete selected. Notice everything that I was doing with all of my basic shapes and everything. When I first opened up the image editor, it had this light blue color, maybe a thin line on the connectors or surrounding borders. I may not want that. Some company may want a 3-point line thickness that's red in color. Well, you can set that also for all the defaults. So I can set the default color of the lines, the thickness, the fill color, font color even, for the text that's defined inside of those annotations. Okay. One thing I also want to point out of the box, let's pull up something here. and I'm going to edit an image and add a user level if the defaults aren't set, but a user at a session level, in this particular instance of the image editor, all of these colors are definable as well, right? So I can change my fonts, I can change, the basic attributes of the font, the text color. I can do things like change the background thickness, or pardon me, the background color, uh, the size, or the color of the line. I can also define how thick I want that line and some other attributes there. Particularly when you select a connector, you can even specify if you want it to be a straight, curved, or right angle type of connector. So there's a lot of, the point being, there's a lot of configuration a user can do with this new image editor. Again, I want to keep emphasis on the key feature of this is being able to recall that SOP image and change its configuration, add, delete, change, and things like that without recreating the entire image all over again. Okay. So that's just a prompt that says I made some changes apparently, and I'm not sure I want to proceed with exiting. Okay, so I will bring this home a little bit because I do want to leave some time at the end for questions, but I will step through the other menus that are available. We have a tools menu. So we have transform and restore. Think of this in context of altering the part position. So I have this on my screen. I'm going to use my transform tool, and I'm going to select this particular component here, and I get the axes, and I can move that component out. While that tool's engaged, right? So I talked about that concept of the tool being engaged. Again, here's your little cheat thing, a little indicator that I have that transform tool in use. I can keep going. I can keep moving parts around and whatnot. But I also have the feature of restoring all of them. Okay. That brings them back to their originally designed CAD position. We have cutting planes. We have all the axes. And keep in mind this toggle visibility button, right? So let's say I want a y-axis cutting plane, right? And let's say I don't want that thing visible because I'm going to take an image of this. So I can take that sliced image and make my SOP image, from that. So I turned off the cutting planes. We also have some measurement capabilities with more to follow, but out of the box, you can do a point-to-point measurement of 2 points that you specify. Now, the unit that comes up will be the unit that is defined by the CAD designer for the overall CAD model, right? So they use meters in this case. As you notice, there's different measurement types. What you can do, depending on how you open up the model. So when I brought up the original list of workspaces, I can specify a setting in there that will give me more flexibility when I open the model on which type of measurements I want to use. For instance, we can use point to point, which I just demonstrated, but we can also do part to part or even radiuses, on some part that have that attribute, obviously. Okay. If we go over the settings, this settings tab is available to all users, right? So this is not necessarily a administrator function at this point. Pardon me. Okay, so the 3D viewer background is just what it says. So maybe I don't want white for whatever I'm doing. Maybe I'm doing a presentation, for a meeting. I can change the color of that background. And obviously we have some out of the box colors, but this feature allows you to do it infinitely, whatever. The use gradient, now in that case, I picked black, right? I can use gradient. And when I do that, it puts a little gradient type of image, representation on the model. Okay. Get back to where I was. So the next portion is transparency. I guess I stepped over it quickly, but when I go to highlight a part, I can set it to be a transparent color. Right now, I have my measurement tool still engaged. Pardon me for the disruption. All right, so I can select a particular part. I can make it transparent. Okay. Now that you say that didn't turn out very transparent, that's because of the settings that we have indicated at that particular point. Okay, so we have it set to more of a gray transparency setting. Okay, to make that more apparent, you can use a base color of whatever you would like and set the transparency or the opacity level for different levels of shade. Think of it that way. Then the user can go and apply it. So maybe I want this rosy brown and I want to apply that. And you can see how the parts that I had set to transparent had changed. Measurement settings. Notice that it had some default settings on there. I can use whatever font, text color, size, so on and so forth, line color that I want, and apply it. And that'll apply it to all the measurements on their screen. Another feature available for the user is if I accidentally turn off some of these panels, right? So let's say I turn off the consumption grid. It's like, wow, how do I get that guy back? Well, you just go to consumption panel, select it, and it's back. If I don't want that access in cube, I can do that, toggle those on and off as well. Last but not least, I want to point out, add in an administrator level. Again, if you have administrator role privileges, I can go and set for my organization some attributes. I can set a default background color. So for your company, you may say all SOP images shall have a background of white. You can change that, and that gets saved to a template definition. So when all users open up the application, they will get that setting, whether to use gradient or not. You notice I had some colors available for coloring parts and whatnot. If you want a particular color or mixture of colors, an administrator can go ahead and, pardon me, go ahead and define that. Notice in our image editor, when that opened up, an administrator can go ahead and set what the default size is. What this default setting, height and width, is set to is the default for our work instruction and SOP reports. So if you've worked with our company, you know you can have a custom report. If that changes, we can go ahead and configure that so it does the proper zoom fit, feel and look, for the end user on your shop floor. All right. With that, that is the overview of our 3D virtual build module. It is new, is available. We'd be happy to demonstrate it further.